The Glass Kingdom. Josephine Reed adjusted her blazer for the fifth time as the private elevator climbed to the 87th floor. The sleek metal box moved silently upward, reflecting her nervous expression in its polished surfaces. 29 years old, with a resume that didn't justify her presence in the headquarters of Frost Innovations, she still couldn't believe she'd made it past the first interview, let alone the final 7. Remember, her new supervisor Olivia had warned during orientation, Mr. Frost values efficiency above all. No small talk, no personal questions, and absolutely no mentions of the outside world unless directly related to business matters. The elevator chimed softly, announcing her arrival at the executive floor. Josephine stepped out into a space that resembled an art installation more than an office. Minimalist white furniture, glass walls, and not a single personal item in sight. The morning light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the San Francisco skyline that surrounded the tower like a distant kingdom. "You're 3 minutes early, Ms. Reed. That's acceptable." The voice came from a man standing with his back to her, gazing out at the city below. Nathaniel Frost didn't turn around as he spoke. "Your credentials have been uploaded to all necessary systems. Your predecessor left detailed protocols. I expect no deviation from established procedures." Josephine swallowed hard. "Yes, Mr. Frost. I've reviewed all materials thoroughly." He finally turned, and Josephine had to control her reaction. Nathaniel Frost was younger than she'd expected, perhaps early 40s, with sharp features and striking blue-gray eyes that seemed to analyze rather than see. His dark hair was precisely cut, his tailored charcoal suit immaculate. Not handsome in the conventional sense, but arresting, like a perfectly rendered digital creation rather than a man of flesh and blood. Your file states you previously worked in humanitarian logistics, an unusual background for this position. His tone wasn't questioning or curious, merely noting a data point. "Yes, sir. 5 years with International Relief Coalition." Then efficiency in crisis should be familiar territory. He gestured to a glass desk positioned outside his office. "Your station. First task, the Jensen merger documents require final review. Second, reschedule the board presentation from Thursday to Wednesday. Third, inform the development team that their deadline remains unchanged despite their request for extension. No welcome, no pleasantries. Just tasks delivered with clinical precision." Throughout that first day, Josephine observed her new employer with careful attention. Nathaniel Frost moved through his world with mathematical precision. Each meeting lasted exactly the allocated time, not a minute more or less. He spoke in complete economical sentences. No hand gestures, no changes in facial expression, no unnecessary words. Most striking was what Olivia had mentioned during her orientation. Nathaniel Frost never left the building. His penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of the tower. The executive offices were directly below. The company's main operations filled the remaining upper floors. A private chef prepared his meals. A medical suite with permanent staff occupied the 82nd floor. "Has he always lived here?" Josephine had asked Olivia during lunch in the employee cafeteria. 7 years now, Olivia replied quietly. "Since the accident. He hasn't set foot outside the Frost Tower since then. Not once." As evening approached, Josephine was organizing the next day's schedule when she noticed something unusual. At precisely 5:17 p.m., Nathaniel Frost stopped reviewing documents and turned his chair toward the windows. Outside, dark clouds had gathered, and rain began to fall over the city. For several minutes, he sat completely still, watching the droplets trace patterns down the glass. In that moment, something in his posture changed, a subtle shift, almost imperceptible. His shoulders lowered slightly. His hand rested palm up on the armrest, and for the briefest moment, Josephine thought she saw longing in those calculating eyes. Then, as if catching himself in an indulgence, he turned sharply back to his desk. "Ms. Reed, you may depart for the day. Tomorrow's meeting with development begins at 7:30 a.m. sharp." "Yes, Mr. Frost, have a good evening," she replied, gathering her things. He didn't respond, already reabsorbed in his digital world. But as Josephine stepped into the elevator, she glanced back at her new employer, the billionaire in his glass kingdom. surrounded by everything and connected to nothing, and wondered what the rain meant to a man who never stepped outside. Coded hearts. 3 weeks into her position as Nathaniel Frost's executive assistant, Josephine had mastered the intricate choreography of his precisely ordered world. She arrived at 7:15 each morning, prepared his preferred black coffee, no sugar, exactly 90 Sibarixi, and had the day's agenda displayed on her tablet before his elevator arrived at 7:30 sharp. She'd learned to anticipate his needs with uncanny accuracy, a skill that earned her not praise but the absence of criticism, which, according to Olivia, was the highest form of approval in Frost's universe. "You've lasted longer than the last 3, remarked Trevor from legal as they shared a table in the cafeteria. "Most people can't handle the robot routine for more than a couple weeks." "He's not a robot," Josephine replied automatically, surprising herself with her defensive tone. "He's just precise." Trevor raised an eyebrow. "The man schedules his bathroom breaks, Joe. He hasn't had a personal conversation in years that wasn't contractually required." Josephine couldn't argue with Trevor's assessment. Yet something bothered her about the way everyone discussed Nathaniel Frost, as if his methodical nature was a character flaw rather than a carefully constructed system. Perhaps it was her background in humanitarian work, where she'd learned that coping mechanisms often masqueraded as personality traits. That afternoon, Josephine was organizing files when a restricted calendar alert appeared on her screen, an appointment labeled simply Project Aurora, scheduled for 10 p.m. The timing was unusual. Nathaniel typically ended his workday at 8:30, following a strict personal routine until morning. When she knocked on his office door at 6:45 p.m. with budget reports, she found him engaged in something she'd never witnessed before. He was sketching on a digital tablet, his movements fluid and quick, unlike his usual measured gestures. "Sir, I've brought the quarterly projections," she announced, pretending not to notice as he hastily switched screens. "Leave them," he replied, his voice carrying its usual flat affect. But there was something different, a slight flush on his neck, as if she'd caught him in an intimate act. Curiosity overwhelmed her professional boundaries. "I noticed Project Aurora on your calendar. Should I prepare any materials for the meeting?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "Project Aurora is personal. It doesn't require your assistance." The dismissal was clear, but instead of retreating, Josephine took an uncharacteristic risk. "Mr. Frost, part of my job is anticipating your needs. I can be more effective if I understand all aspects of your schedule, including personal projects." She expected him to reprimand her for overstepping, but instead he studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment. "Very well. Return at 9:45 p.m., wear comfortable shoes. And Ms. Reed, this remains confidential." When Josephine returned that evening, the office had transformed. The screens in Nathaniel's office displayed complex schematics for what appeared to be neural interface devices, sleeker and smaller than anything on the market. "Project Aurora," Nathaniel stated, noticing her studying the displays, "is not a Frost Innovations initiative. It's independently funded through my personal accounts." He led her to a private elevator she hadn't known existed, which descended to a floor absent from the building's official plans. When the doors opened, Josephine found herself in a state-of-the-art laboratory unlike anything in the company's R&D department. But what truly shocked her wasn't the technology. It was the wall of photos showing children wearing prototype devices similar to those in the schematics. "These children have neurological conditions that limit communication," Nathaniel explained, his voice still measured but somehow softer. "Conventional interfaces fail them because they require standardized neural responses. Aurora adapts to individual patterns, allowing expression where traditional methods can't." For 2 hours, Josephine watched as Nathaniel conducted a video conference with doctors from a children's hospital in Boston, discussing improvements to a device that had allowed a 7-year-old girl with severe cerebral palsy to communicate independently for the first time. There was no corporate branding, no press, no marketing strategy, just Nathaniel Frost working with meticulous care to refine technology that would never appear on a Frost Innovations balance sheet. Why keep this secret? Josephine asked as they returned to the executive floor. This technology could help thousands, and the publicity would be enormously positive for the company. Nathaniel's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Aurora isn't about Frost Innovations' image. The moment it becomes public, it becomes a product. Expectations, deadlines, profit margins. These children aren't customers, Ms. Reed. They're people who deserve solutions designed for their needs, not shareholders. As the elevator doors opened to the empty executive floor, Josephine realized she was seeing a different side of Nathaniel Frost. Not warmer or more emotional, but purposeful in a way that transcended business logic. He still moved with the same precision, spoke with the same economy of words, but now she understood that his rigidity wasn't coldness. It was concentration, focused on problems most people never bothered to solve. "Will you require assistance with Aurora moving forward?" she asked as they reached his office. "Tuesday and Friday evenings, 10 p.m. Document preparation and correspondence management initially." He paused, then added something Josephine had never heard from him before. "If you're willing." It wasn't quite a request, but it wasn't a directive either. For the first time, Nathaniel Frost had acknowledged that someone else's choice mattered. "I am," she replied simply. As she gathered her things to leave, the soft patter of rain began against the windows. As always, Nathaniel turned to watch the droplets slide down the glass, his expression unchanging yet somehow wistful. But this time, when he turned back, he caught her observing him and held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. "The rain," she ventured. "You always watch it." He didn't answer immediately, and Josephine feared she'd overstepped again. But finally, he said, "Rain is one of the few natural phenomena visible from this height. A reminder that some systems operate beyond our control." Then, almost as an afterthought, "Good night, Josephine." It was the first time he had used her first name. The storm within. By mid-October, Josephine had settled into a dual role, professional executive assistant by day, collaborator on Project Aurora by night. The distinction between these worlds gradually blurred as Nathaniel began incorporating her insights into both spheres of his work. Her background in humanitarian logistics proved unexpectedly valuable in identifying distribution challenges for Aurora's prototypes, earning her not just Nathaniel's attention but his growing reliance. "Your approach to the Chilean hospital network is more efficient than our initial model," he noted one evening as they reviewed implementation strategies. Not quite praise, but acknowledgement, which from Nathaniel Frost felt like a standing ovation. The change in their professional relationship was subtle, but undeniable. His instructions became less directive, more collaborative. He began asking for her opinion on matters beyond administrative details. And occasionally, very occasionally, Josephine caught him watching her when he thought she was absorbed in her work. Yet for all this evolution, Nathaniel's self-imposed boundaries remained absolute. He never discussed personal matters, never mentioned the accident that had confined him to Frost Tower, and never, under any circumstances, ventured near the building's exits until the storm. Weather forecasters had been tracking the system for days, an atmospheric river funneling unprecedented rainfall toward Northern California. By late afternoon, San Francisco was under siege. Lightning fractured the darkened sky. Thunder rattled the windows, and even on the 87th floor, the howling wind was audible through the reinforced glass. At 4:37 p.m., as the storm reached its peak intensity, the building's power fluctuated. Emergency systems engaged immediately, but for 3 seconds. Frost Tower existed in twilight, long enough for Josephine to glimpse Nathaniel's reaction, a rigid grip on his desk edge, pupils dilated, breathing suddenly shallow and rapid. The moment passed quickly, order restored with the backup generators. But something had shifted in Nathaniel's demeanor. His movements became mechanical, his responses delayed. When Olivia arrived with an update from building services, he barely acknowledged her presence. "Mr. Frost?" Josephine ventured after Olivia departed. "Building services assures us the emergency systems are functioning perfectly. There's no cause for concern. I'm aware of the building's capabilities, Ms. Reed." His voice was tight, controlled. Too controlled. An alert chimed on both their screens. "Emergency protocol activated. All personnel evacuate immediately." Josephine's phone rang instantly. Olivia, her voice tense but measured. "False alarm in the system. IT is working to clear it, but protocol requires evacuation until verification. You need to get him downstairs." "He doesn't leave the building," Josephine whispered. "Joe, listen to me. The safety systems are registering phantom structural stress from the storm. We have to follow protocol until engineering confirms there's no actual damage. Get him to the lobby or at least the sky bridge. I don't care how you do it." Josephine ended the call and found Nathaniel standing before the windows, watching the storm with an expression she couldn't interpret, not his usual contemplative observation, but something closer to confrontation. "Mr. Frost, we need to evacuate temporarily. It's just a system error." "But I don't evacuate." His voice was flat, final. "Sir, it's standard protocol. I am aware of the protocol. Ms. Reed, which includes exceptions for medical necessity. Consider this such a case." Josephine took a careful step toward him. What medical necessity would that be? For several seconds, only the sound of rain battering the windows filled the space between them. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. "I cannot go outside. Cannot or will not." His gaze remained fixed on the storm. "Is there a meaningful distinction?" Another alert blared through the building. "Immediate evacuation required. This is not a drill." Josephine made a decision then, one that could cost her job but felt necessary in ways she couldn't fully articulate. She moved to stand directly beside him, close enough that their reflections merged in the rain-streaked glass. "Nathaniel," she said softly, using his first name for the first time. "What happened 7 years ago?" He didn't answer, but his breathing changed. Quicker, shallower. "The accident," she pressed gently. "The one that keeps you inside these walls." Lightning illuminated the city, casting harsh shadows across his face. "Not an accident," he finally said. "A choice." The evacuation alarm continued its insistent warning, but Josephine remained still, waiting. 7 years. 2 months and 14 days ago, I was in Taipei, he continued, his voice clinical despite the evident effort it cost him. "A presentation for potential investors. 23 stories up, floor-to-ceiling windows like these. I watched a maintenance platform break. 2 workers. I called for help, but the platform..." He stopped, swallowed. "Physics is uncompromising, Josephine. 8.3 seconds from failure to impact." Josephine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the building's temperature. "You witnessed a fatal accident. I witnessed the consequence of poorly designed safety protocols. Protocols I could have improved had I been consulted. Had I been paying attention to anything beyond quarterly projections." His reflection in the glass remained expressionless, but his voice betrayed what his face wouldn't. "I don't leave buildings because height is no longer the danger. It's what happens when you're close enough to see expressions change in those 8.3 seconds, but too far away to do anything but watch." Another crash of thunder. Closer this time, and the lights flickered again. Nathaniel's hand moved unconsciously toward Josephine's, not quite touching but seeking proximity. Understanding dawned on her with sudden clarity. The rain. That's why you always watch it. Rain was falling that day too, he said, his voice barely audible. I track the patterns to ensure they remain random. Predictable patterns would suggest memory distortion. The building's emergency system switched to a new message. Evacuation suspended, remain in place, engineering assessment in progress. Relief visibly washed through Nathaniel, though his posture remained rigid. For several minutes, they stood in silence, watching the storm rage against the immovable tower. When he finally turned from the window, Josephine was struck by the vulnerability evident in his usually impenetrable gaze. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For not insisting I leave. For asking why instead of demanding compliance." Josephine nodded, understanding the significance of this small confession. "The world doesn't always require you to go outside, Nathaniel. Sometimes it's enough to let someone else in." As the storm gradually subsided, something subtle had changed between them. A barrier breached, not by force, but by recognition. Nathaniel Frost, the man who had built walls of glass to separate himself from a world he couldn't control, had allowed Josephine to see what lay behind them, and for the first time in 7 years, he didn't immediately look away. Broken barriers. The aftermath of the storm brought a different kind of weather to Frost Tower, a shifting atmospheric pressure between Nathaniel and Josephine that everyone around them seemed to notice. Trevor from legal raised knowing eyebrows when Nathaniel began taking his morning coffee in Josephine's office rather than alone. Olivia tactfully rearranged scheduling to accommodate their increasingly frequent project consultations. Even the cleaning staff noted that the pristine glass wall between their offices now remained open more often than closed. What no one else witnessed were the gradual revelations that occurred. During late evenings working on Aurora, Nathaniel's clinical efficiency remained, but alongside it emerged something new, moments of unguarded humanity that Josephine collected like rare specimens, the way he absently rubbed his left wrist when deep in thought, his unexpected preference for mint tea over coffee after 7 p.m., the almost imperceptible smile when Aurora's lead neuroscientist reported successful trials with a 10-year-old patient who had spoken his first words. Through their interface. 3 weeks after the storm, Josephine arrived at work to find an unfamiliar item on her desk. A small wooden box with an inlaid compass rose. "My father was a navigational engineer," Nathaniel explained when he found her examining it. He believed in having physical anchors to counterbalance digital dependencies. That was his. Josephine carefully opened the box to find a beautifully crafted brass compass nestled in velvet. "It's beautiful." "But why?" "You provided direction during the storm," he said simply, as if the metaphor required no elaboration. Considerate acknowledgement of effective navigation. Coming from anyone else, the gesture might have seemed modest. From Nathaniel Frost, it was unprecedented, a personal artifact shared. A family history revealed, a sentiment expressed without clinical detachment. That evening, as they reviewed Aurora's latest neural mapping protocols, Josephine found herself studying Nathaniel more than the data. The careful precision of his movements, the intensity of his focus, the occasional unconscious gesture that betrayed emotions his expression never revealed. All had become as familiar to her as her own. "Habits. You're observing me rather than the interface specifications," he noted without looking up from his tablet. Josephine didn't bother denying it. Their relationship had evolved beyond such pretenses. "I'm trying to understand the full picture. The specifications are quite detailed." "I meant you, Nathaniel." "The full picture of you?" He set down his tablet then, meeting her gaze directly. "What remains unclear?" "Everything that happened between Taipei and now. You've told me why you stay inside, but not how you've lived with it for 7 years. Not what it costs you." For a long moment he was silent, his expression unreadable. Then he rose, walked to the windows now cleared of rain, and gestured for her to join him. "Do you see the construction on Market Street?" he asked, pointing to a site 20 blocks away. "I've monitored that project daily for the past 18 months. They're implementing safety harness systems I designed after Taipei. Systems that would have saved those workers?" Josephine studied his profile against the night skyline. "You've been redesigning safety protocols?" "For every major construction project in 17 countries, anonymously. It's not atonement, nothing could be. It's correction of systemic flaws." He turned to face her fully. "The cost, as you put it, is calculated. I remain inside because proximity to height creates physiological responses that interfere with cognitive function. My work requires optimal cognitive function. Your work or your control?" The question escaped before Josephine could consider its implications. Instead of withdrawing as she feared, Nathaniel seemed to consider her words with genuine reflection. Perhaps they've become synonymous. After a pause, he added, "The distinction warrants examination." What followed was the most honest conversation of Josephine's life. For hours, they talked, really talked, about the architecture of isolation Nathaniel had constructed around himself, how his trauma had calcified into methodology, how efficiency had become both shield and prison. In turn, Josephine shared her own carefully. Guarded truths, how her humanitarian work had been driven less by altruism than by a desperate need to create order from chaos after losing her mother to a preventable medical error. How her obsessive organization mirrored his control mechanisms, just with warmer presentation. "We're not so different," she concluded as midnight approached. "We both build systems to manage what frightens us. Mine just have better social camouflage. Your systems permit connection," he countered. "Mine systematically eliminate it." And yet, here we are. Something shifted in his expression then, the analytical distance giving way to simple, human recognition. "Yes," he acknowledged softly. "Here we are." Neither could later recall who moved first, but the space between them closed. His hand found hers, fingers interlacing with the same precision he applied to everything, yet trembling slightly with the novelty of human contact. When they kissed, it was neither the passionate collision of romantic fantasies nor the tentative exploration of new lovers, but something uniquely theirs. Careful, deliberate, and absolutely present. When they finally separated, Nathaniel's usual composure was pleasantly disrupted, hair slightly disheveled where her fingers had traced through it, collar askew, breathing pattern irregular. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely surprised. "This complicates matters," he said, in such a perfectly Nathaniel way that Josephine couldn't help laughing. "That's generally how meaningful relationships work," she replied, straightening his collar with familiar ease. "They're magnificently complicated." He considered this with characteristic thoroughness. "I have limited experience with such complications. I've noticed. My limitations are significant, Josephine. I don't know when or if I'll ever leave this building. The world outside remains," he searched for the precise term, "prohibitive." Josephine took his hand again, her touch gentle but firm. "The world is big, Nathaniel, but we can start small, one step at a time." He nodded, not in agreement but in acknowledgement of possibility, which for Nathaniel Frost represented a seismic shift in perspective. "One step," he repeated, looking down at their joined hands with an expression of wonder that all his wealth and intelligence had never before produced. Outside the windows of his glass kingdom, the lights of San Francisco glittered like earthbound stars, no longer separated from him by impenetrable barriers, but waiting, patient as the rain, for when he might be ready to reach them. Beyond the glass, winter gave way to spring, marking 6 months since Josephine had first stepped into Frost Tower. 6 months of transformation, gradual, deliberate, and profound. Project Aurora had progressed from prototype to pilot program in 3 hospitals, with plans for expansion to 17 more by year's end. Frost Innovations had restructured its corporate giving to prioritize accessibility technology, a shift that business publications attributed to evolving market awareness rather than the private evolution of its founder, and Nathaniel Frost, still contained within his glass tower, had nevertheless expanded his world in ways that defied measurement. Their relationship developed with the same methodical care that characterized everything in Nathaniel's orbit, but with a warmth that gradually permeated the sterile environment of Frost Tower. His penthouse, once a minimalist testament to efficiency, now held evidence of Josephine's presence, books with actual paper pages, a hand-woven throw on the sofa, fresh flowers delivered weekly. Small disruptions to perfect order that Nathaniel not only tolerated but welcomed. "You've domesticated him," Olivia remarked one afternoon, watching through the glass walls as Nathaniel actually laughed at something. Josephine said, a sound so unexpected that several nearby employees looked up in alarm. "Nobody domesticates Nathaniel," Josephine replied. "He's just expanding his parameters." Those parameters now included weekly virtual sessions with Dr. Eleanor Westfield, a trauma specialist who had worked extensively with Aurora patients. Nathaniel approached his therapy with the same analytical rigor he applied to engineering problems, documenting his progress with meticulous precision. Some weeks showed advancement, others regression, all carefully noted in journals that he shared with Josephine not as personal revelations, but as data they jointly analyzed. Exposure. Therapy traditionally involves graduated physical proximity to triggers, he explained one evening as they reviewed his progress. Dr. Westfield has modified the approach to accommodate my situation. Josephine studied the journal entries, noting the increasing duration of his tolerance for virtual simulations of outdoor environments. These numbers are impressive, but numbers aren't everything, Nathaniel. How do you feel about the progress? He considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. I experience approximately 62% less autonomic nervous system activation when viewing height simulations. Cognitive interruption has decreased by a comparable margin. Then, with the hint of a smile that had become less rare, I believe Dr. Westfield would say I'm feeling better. On a clear April morning, Josephine arrived at work to find Nathaniel standing before his windows, watching a construction crane operate on a building across the street. Nothing unusual in itself, he often observed such operations, mentally checking for safety compliance. But today, something was different in his posture. A determined tension she recognized from breakthrough moments on Project Aurora. I've made a decision, he announced without preamble when she entered. Today is the 7-year anniversary of my self-imposed confinement. Josephine set down her tablet, giving him her full attention. I know. 7 years is sufficient data collection to establish patterns. Continued isolation yields diminishing returns for trauma mitigation while increasing opportunity costs. He turned to face her fully. I'm going outside today. The simple declaration hung between them, monumental in its implications. Are you certain? She asked carefully. No, he admitted, and the honesty of it made her love him all the more. Statistical probability of success is approximately 72%, assuming controlled conditions and graduated exposure. Dr. Westfield concurs with the assessment. Josephine moved closer, taking his hands in hers, a gesture that had once seemed impossible, but now felt like the most natural thing in the world. What can I do? The plan, meticulously detailed, involved precise timing and carefully selected conditions. The building's sky bridge on the 35th floor, connecting Frost Tower to its companion building across a narrow service street. 4:30 p.m., when the angle of sunlight would be optimal without being overwhelming. A duration of exactly 3 minutes, with exit protocols clearly established. Dr. Westfield would be on standby via secure video link. Building security would ensure complete privacy. A controlled first step, Nathaniel explained as the afternoon approached. Limited variables, minimal exposure to height triggers, familiar visual context. Despite his calm analysis, Josephine could read the tension in him, the slightly too perfect posture, the microscopic tremor in his left hand that only she would notice. As they rode the elevator down to the 35th floor, she maintained the steady conversation he needed, discussing Aurora's latest neural interface refinements as if this were any other Tuesday. The sky bridge itself was a marvel of engineering, a transparent tunnel suspended between buildings, providing a 360-degree view of the city while maintaining the climate-controlled environment Nathaniel required. Currently empty due to scheduled maintenance, it awaited them like a crystal passage to another world. At the entrance, Nathaniel paused, his breathing pattern shifting subtly. Josephine remained beside him, present but not hovering, supportive but not insistent. The parameters are optimal, he said, as much to himself as to her. Structural integrity exceeds requirements by 347%. Wind conditions are nominal. Visual acclimation is proceeding within expected ranges. Josephine recognized the litany for what it was, not engineering assessment but self-regulation, a methodical calming technique Dr. Westfield had helped him develop. When he finished, she simply asked, "Ready?" He nodded once, decisive, and they stepped onto the bridge together. For the first 30 seconds, Nathaniel moved with mechanical precision, eyes fixed on the far door rather than the panoramic view. His grip on Josephine's hand was firm but not desperate, his breathing controlled if slightly too measured. Then gradually his steps slowed, and he allowed his gaze to shift toward the windows. San Francisco spread beneath them, alive with movement and color. Not the distant abstract pattern he observed from his office, but a vibrant middle distance, close enough to feel connected, far enough to process without overwhelming detail. "It's different," he said quietly, "from this elevation. More immediate." Josephine watched his face as he studied the city, the subtle play of emotions so easily missed by those who expected dramatic expressions. Wonder in the slight widening of his eyes, tension in the tightening at the corners of his mouth, determination in the set of his jaw. 1 minute, 17 seconds, he noted, still monitoring his internal responses with scientific precision. Then, with a hint of surprise, heart rate elevated but within functional parameters, cognitive processing intact. They reached the midpoint of the bridge, where the view was most expansive. By silent mutual agreement, they paused there, Nathaniel's attention now fully engaged with the world outside his controlled environment. For 2 full minutes, he simply observed the traffic patterns below, the architectural details of neighboring buildings, the way sunlight reflected differently at this elevation than from his office 87 floors above. "There are nuances I've been missing," he said eventually, his voice softer than Josephine had ever heard it. "Details that don't register from a distance." She followed his gaze to where he was watching a family on a rooftop garden several buildings away, parents and a small child planting something in raised beds. Their movements animated by laughter Josephine could almost hear despite the distance and soundproofed glass. "Life happens in the middle distances," she offered gently. "Not so far away that we only see patterns, not so close that we only see problems." Nathaniel considered this with his usual thoroughness, then nodded. An accurate assessment. After another moment of observation, he added, 3 minutes have elapsed. We should proceed to the exit as planned." They completed the crossing without incident, Nathaniel's vital signs remaining within his defined acceptable ranges. When they reached the other side, returning to the controlled environment of Frost Tower's satellite offices, Josephine expected him to express relief or satisfaction with the successful experiment. Instead, he turned to her with an expression she'd never seen before. Open, unguarded, almost vulnerable in its honesty. It was both more and less difficult than anticipated. How so? The physiological responses were less severe than projected models suggested, but the emotional components were more complex. He paused, searching for precise language for imprecise experiences. "I felt regret for time lost, anger at self-limitation, hope for future expansion, all simultaneously without clear categorical boundaries." Josephine smiled, recognizing the significance of this admission. "Those sound like very human reactions to me." Indeed. He glanced back at the sky bridge they had just crossed. "Dr. Westfield would consider this a significant therapeutic milestone. And what do you consider it?" Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. His analytical mind, processing experiences his emotional framework was still learning to accommodate. "A beginning," he finally said. "Insufficient as a destination, but necessary as a point of origin." As they rode the elevator back to the executive floor, Josephine noticed subtle changes in Nathaniel's demeanor, a slight relaxation in his posture, a new quality of awareness in his gaze, as if seeing familiar surroundings from a shifted,